So thanks everybody for coming. I've done this for a number of years now, I don't know how many years, but it's a very informal talk about the common materials in historic buildings, but also about how they're used and what sort of, as a passerby, you can look for. So I hope after this you're all walking around looking up, looking for pieces of terracotta, looking for different types of stone, looking for slate roofs, copper roofs, because we really, in New York City in particular, we have a terrific spread of historic building materials, a terrific spread of buildings. The oldest building my office is working on now goes back to 1660, which is the Batten House in Flushing, the birthplace of religious freedom in America. Go Quakers. And we work on buildings all the way up to some very sad, recently finished buildings that need a lot of work. There's a lot of poor construction. So the way this works is it's kind of a top-down, just informal march through the materials that we find in New York City's historic buildings and how they work. So we sort of start with roofing materials, we progress to facade elements, windows, and I think we finish with stained glass. So this is, I think, is a nice place to start. This is a really accessible little project of ours. This is the park keeper's house at the community park in Sunnyside Gardens, Queens. I don't know if people have been to Sunnyside Gardens. It's a remarkable experiment in affordable housing from the 1920s. And it's groups of 1, 2, and 3 family houses centered around courtyards that are planted. Really quite beautiful, especially in the summer. This is a one-of-a-kind house, though. This is the only park keeper's house there is. It's got a little apartment upstairs. It's got restrooms and an office on the first floor. And in the background is the machinery for the ancient kiddie pool, which you see in the distance. What we did here was a slate roof and some siding work. And I think it's a good place to start because it's a very, very simple slate roof. And it also has some very simple copper work to look at. So slate is really the daddy of all roofing materials in our environment. It's a stone that's laid down and compressed. It's a metamorphic stone that's laid down and compressed in sheets. There's a slate here if you want to pass it around. This is a scallop slate from St. Andrew's Church in Harlem. And just picking up and looking at it, you can see what slate has that makes it such a wonderful natural roofing material. And that's the fact that it really is laid down in thin beds, and it's actually split in the quarry. If you ever see them quarry it, it can be split with a chisel, and it splits along fault lines to make a perfect natural shingle or roof tile. It can be trimmed and cut. Slate, like a lot of the roofing materials we talk about, depends on its sequence of installation and how it's installed to work properly. And we'll talk about that when we get to copper as well, in terms of the difference between the kind of roofing that we think about today on modern buildings and the kind of roofing that people did back then. This is not that old, this is 1926. But this roofing, like the copper roofing, depends not on materials that cure and form a skin to keep water out. It depends almost entirely on the configuration of how the materials are laid down. So when that gets back around to me, I'll hold it up and we'll talk a little about how it all works. You can see that if you look at this, there are 2 holes that are punched in it. Those are nail holes. And slate is never tightly nailed to a building, but it's always hung. And it should be hung from copper nails. So a good slater will know to drive the nail just far enough so that the head sticks out about 1/16 of an inch and the slate actually hangs there. And it hangs there, and it has to hang at a certain pitch in order for the roof to work. The roof here depends, there's no elastomeric materials, there's no sealant, there's nothing between the slates but a small amount of air. And the slates sit down by their weight and shed water by a process called shingling, which means that each successive slate overlaps the one below it. And you can see how that works here. This part of the slate was covered by its opposite number above it. So only this part was what we call the exposure, or to the weather, which meant that this was the only part that you saw. So when you look at a slate roof, you may think you're seeing 1 layer of material, but you're usually seeing no less than 3 at any given point. If you were to drill through at any point here, you'd find about 3 levels. The other thing you're looking at here are copper snow guards, which are created. This is a proprietary B&B snow guard, a traditional one that's made with a hook. So it basically just hooks on the nail. That's the same nail that's holding the slate. So I reach up underneath and I do that. So the thing to remember about traditional roofing is it all depends on pitch. If this were like this, I would not, the water would not shed fast enough for the slate to work. It's got to be like this or higher. And sometimes on our mansard roofs, and we'll see some of those, it's extremely well pitched. And so it's all about getting the water off the surface. Now there are underlayments that go under this, and we'll see some of those when we get to the copper roofing. But that really is the granddaddy of roofing materials here in New York. Like a lot of the materials that we're going to be talking about, it has the benefit of being pretty local. From Pennsylvania and upstate New York, there are still slate quarries that are operating. So here's a transition from the slate roof to another very traditional form of roofing, and this is what's called a flat seam roof. This is a roof that we can do using sheets of copper. In this case, so there's an example of some copper right there. That's actually a sample of standing seam roof before it gets bent and crimped. We can use copper roofing on this type of flat, almost flat surface because we're locking and soldering every seam, which means each piece is made with a lock on it or a hook that gets dressed down with a hammer and then soldered completely. If we had more pitch, we might very well use a standing seam or a batten seam roof, and we're going to look at an example of a batten seam roof, and I have an example of an unfinished standing seam roof here. Copper is a wonderful material. It's a naturally successful roofing material here in our climate because among its many great qualities is that it takes on a natural patina. And if you think of why the Statue of Liberty, which is actually largely copper, is green, it's because it's been oxidized in our acidic environment. And it's interesting, if you're a material geek like me, it's interesting. It may not be interesting to everybody, but the fact that we're actually seeing less aging of copper because of clean air standards. So back in the day when everybody burned coal in New York, we had a nice mixture for aging copper. It wasn't nice for children to breathe, but it was a nice mixture for aging copper. It was nearly perfect. It created a lovely sulfuric acid that brought about that nice green. The green is actually a kind of self-healing patina, which is really amazing and wonderful about copper. So it starts out as what we call red copper or uncoated copper, and it gradually turns that green patina. But the patina typically has a protective element to it too. So it's a natural material that protects itself in our environment. It's a funny material because it's still, like a lot of our traditional materials, it's still measured in traditional ways. So if you think about the gauges of steel, for example, there are numbered gauges for the thicknesses of sheet metal. And so 0.7, aluminum is actually measured in thousandths of an inch. Copper is measured in ounces. And it's actually how much a square yard of copper weighs. So this is 16-ounce copper, which is a good grade for roofing. So it's thin, it's malleable, it can be bent, it can be soldered easily. The next step up from that is 24-ounce copper. So if you want to think of like a truly archaic way of measuring something, you take an outdated measurement like a square yard and you apply ounces to it, just to make things really complicated. 36-ounce copper is really serious stuff. The Statue of Liberty is made out of about 48-ounce copper, which is almost the thickness of a penny. So if you think about it, and the way that happens is the copper is basically beaten out. Now it's done by machines, but it used to be done by hand. And it can be rolled to certain thicknesses. And so those are the thicknesses we have available to us.
What did you say was the 32-ounce? You said one was the...
32-ounce and then 48-ounce would be something on the order of the skin of the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, okay, that's what I was
We use 24-ounce when we're in very difficult circumstances where we think there's going to be a lot of wear and tear on it.
Like
Most of
weather or
weather.
or something?
Yep, weather. If we want something that's really tough. This I think was 16-ounce. It might have been 24-ounce because we never wanted to go back up there again, having done all this work.
And that's not lead solder, or is it?
It is lead. That's lead tin solder. Yeah. And there are other varieties now we try and get away from lead. There also is a material called lead-coated copper, which we don't really use much anymore. We now tend to use a different material called zinc-coated copper, which...
What's the name of that? I think I've heard of that.
Zinc-coated copper is called Freedom Gray.
What's the lead-coated copper called?
Lead-coated copper. Doesn't have any trade names, yeah.
There's a special word.
Yeah, you'd think that they might want a catchy name for something that's so potentially dangerous.
Like Finkel or something.
Yeah, Pringles.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So this is the roof of Grace Church in Brooklyn Heights. And this is a new batten seam roof going on. So just like slate roofing, what you're seeing here is a roof that depends for its water shedding ability entirely on the way it's configured. So this uses the concept of pans and raised joints. So if I throw water into a pan, it will either stay in the pan or it'll go off to the side. If I make a continuous row of pans, I'm always shedding water down between the raised seams. In this case, it's a batten seam. There it is, going together. So it's actually, the caps are actually crimped over wooden battens. This is actually an insulated roof, which makes them very happy because they used to pour money down the drain in terms of heating this church. It's gorgeous if you have a chance to go. It's on Hicks Street in Brooklyn Heights. We did this in conjunction with Leo Blackman Architects, who were working with our Landmark Lion this year, Evergreen Architectural Arts, who were doing the restoration of the interior ceiling, which is glorious. Wow. It's a beautiful blue and gold starburst that had been overpainted many, many years ago. Around the turn of the 20th century, someone decided it was too bright, that it was too high Victorian. But now it's back, and it's absolutely glorious. And so they did the right thing here. A lot of churches will collect money, spend it on their beautiful interior, and not touch the roof, which is really stupid. Right? So they put on a new insulated roof and did the work on the interior, and the whole result is wonderful. So here we're depending on those raised joints, and why don't you pass me the copper pieces? So you can see they're sort of linked together. This is a slightly simpler form of roofing called standing seam roofing. And the way this works is similar in that first of all, I have to have a good pitch. I have to make sure that the water is always flowing down to the gutter where I want it to go and not back or side to side into the church. It uses the idea of a raised seam. Now this is an unfinished seam. What happens is this gets folded twice and locked down and dressed down so it's nice and tight. But even then, there's no sealant, there's no goop, there's no skin-like material to keep the water out. It depends entirely on the ability of the roofing to be pitched enough to shed water from seam to pan and then down to gutter, right? And if you think about it, the people who figured this out centuries ago, there was a kind of genius to it because they didn't have the kind of materials that we have now. Now you can basically just, if you want things to look smooth, you can just paint something on. We have resin base, and we were actually, in this project, we actually used some resin base. Why don't you sort of pass this around, but be careful. Some of the edges here are a little sharp, so we haven't had anybody get cut yet. So here it is going on, and what you're seeing is the battens, and the battens are nailed down or screwed down. The copper turns up the side of the batten, and there's a hook and a cover goes on. So a little hat goes on each one, and what you're seeing here are what are called staggered cross joints. So if you see the horizontal joints in the roof, those are also a locked seam, right? So a hook, one inside the other, always done so that the water sheds over the hook and not into it. And you can see that they're staggered. So we're using all of this old technology to prevent water from going side to side, in underneath the battens. We're keeping everything, and all we're using here is gravity. And if you think about it, it really is genius. Right? We used some modern materials in the gutters. Down there, that's actually a resin-based gutter lining because we felt it was not visible, and we felt that was appropriate to do there. So we get a nice long life out of that. But the roof works entirely based on its configuration, its pitch, and the effect of gravity on water. Here's a close-up of the small ornamental one that's between the parish house and the church. So here we're using copper both as the roofing and as what we call flashing. Flashing is the turned-up copper and sometimes the built-in copper that protects the juncture of the roof and the wall, which is just as important as the roofing. If all we knew how to do was roofing and we just stopped dead at the wall, we'd have leaks at the end of every roof. Here's more soldered seams. This is a gutter inside that. So this is when it's really new. And so it's really shiny, which can be glaring to people. This is aged to a nice brown now, and it's well on the way to looking really great. It looks as though it's been there for decades. Here's that flat seam roof, and you can see the difference between the roof we were just doing and this one, and that difference is pitch. When we get below a certain pitch, meaning things flatten out, we don't have the luxury of shedding water the way that the Grace Church roof did. Instead, we have to depend on something that's much more akin to a modern roof, which is squares of copper that have built-in locked edges that get hooked to each other and then hammered down and then soldered completely. It's really labor intensive. And when you compare this to the type of roofing that we do now, where you basically are spreading out a goop, maybe embedding something in it, like a fleece, or torching things down. If you're ever walking around neighborhoods and you hear the roar of the roofing torch, that's someone melting a roof into place. Very effective technology, but much, much less labor intensive. The other thing to remember when we talk about historic materials is who put them down? Who was using this stuff? I always like to tell the story of St. Luke's Church in Upper Manhattan at 141st Street and Convent Avenue. It's a church that for various political reasons was never finished on the inside. It's an Episcopal church and huge Romanesque church. And you go in and there's some of the capitals, they're brownstone capitals, are carved, and other ones are still just blocks. And you think, why did they do that, first of all? And why weren't they carving these things on a bench somewhere? Right? It's a lot easier to put a big piece of stone down on a nice sturdy workbench in front of you and carve it than it is to carve it in place. Labor was cheap, so the scaffolding was cheap. The people doing the stone carving were inexpensive. There was lots and lots of available labor, and the materials were relatively inexpensive at that time. So you think about the difference in the work that we do on buildings today versus what happened back at the turn of the last century and before. You're dealing with an incredibly willing and ample source of labor. And that really has an effect on the way we use materials. If you have the unpleasant situation of sitting through a manufacturer's presentation about some modern material today, they'll always talk to you about how idiot-proof it is and how easy it is and how it will save so much money for the owner of the building because we can do this so fast. And so we always respond that we really don't want idiots working on our projects. We'd rather have things that aren't idiot-proof. Wood, always like to mention, is a component in a lot of New York City buildings. You don't think of it as being that present, but we have wood windows. This is a wood cornice in Fort Greene. It's undergoing the kind of deterioration that we see in wood, which could be a topic of a whole other evening. Wood is among the only materials we use that was once alive. It's a plant, so it can rot. Bugs like it. There are all sorts of things we have to do to deal with wood. There it is. This is a cornice in an advanced state of deterioration. There's really not much you can do here once it's gone this far other than replace the element. Unfortunately, we have people who can still do this and do it quite well. A lot of this can be prevented by properly painting it and making sure it doesn't get wet and stay wet. Sheet metal. Sheet metal other than copper is a great component that we see a lot in New York, and we may not even realize that we're seeing it. One of the things that, there's the old line that they don't build them like they used to, right? Everything was always better. It's not necessarily true. Everything also wasn't real. The history of architecture in New York and in all sorts of other cities is one of avarice, basically. It's putting up a building, making it do what you want it to do, and making the most money possible out of it. Right? And that hasn't changed, right? So if you're a builder and you can choose between a huge hunk of stone to have projecting that you have to have someone carve, or a piece of sheet metal that you can have someone hammer into a mold and is tiny in terms of weight, you might very well choose the sheet metal. So this is a good example of a substitute material. Someone painted this black years ago. This is 395 Broadway, a 1901 building at Broadway and Walker Street in Tribeca. It's an entire limestone facade, but when you get to the very, very top, there's this magnificent projecting cornice. And there it is after restoration. And it was painted, we know through some research, it was painted to look like the limestone originally. So it was a fake. It was a considered fake. It was, someone said, I want this visual interest. I want these huge modillion brackets. Those modillion brackets it's a little hard to see for scale here, but those are the curlicue brackets there. A good-sized child could take a bath in one of those. This is a really monumental cornice. The lion's heads were a figure of Meineke, who was the architect, his work. If you look at a Meineke building, the chances are very good that you're going to see lion's heads on his cornice. Those are all made out of pressed zinc. And so they're pressed into a mold rather than carved out of a solid material. The whole thing weighs a fraction of what it would have weighed if it were made in actual limestone. But it's made to look like limestone. A couple of ways that you'll be able to spot sheet metal. If you look closely at it, you can often see the seams. The other thing you see is one of my favorite terms, which is called oil canning. And it's a perfectly descriptive term because if you think of an oil can, how an oil can, old-fashioned oil can goes dink, 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 and it dents in. So if you see denting similar to an oil can, that's a giveaway that it's sheet metal. Rust, if it's galvanized sheet metal, you may see rusts and streaks of rust on it, even if it's been perfectly painted or if it's sometimes even sand painted. So they would even throw sand into the paint to give it more of a natural stone-like effect. But if you think of the savings here, I've got all this visual, this thing sticks out so far, and here's the next slide. We climbed down inside it with these two wonderful Polish gentlemen from West New York Restoration because we wanted to see that the structure was okay. This thing projects so far from the building that when you look down, when you're inside the cornice, we noticed that there were little flashes of yellow. And what those were is there were gaps or holes in the sheet metal cornice, and those were cabs going down Broadway. We were so far out that when we looked down, we saw the street traffic. The thing was actually in pretty good shape. There's a wood roof to it. These are all old steel or iron supports, and that's the back of the sheet metal. And you can see how flimsy it is. It's just a piece of sheet metal that's tied back with baling wire and anchors. It's all built up to look like this monumental thing, but it just weighs a couple of pounds. You can also think about what would be required if this thing were solid masonry to support this thing. Think about how much counterweight you'd have to have, right? I always use the example, if you're standing, say you work in an office downtown on Broadway, and it's where the ticket tape parades go by, and you have a very fat coworker who gets very excited at a parade, and he starts leaning out the window, and he starts leaning, and you feel like he's leaning too far, so you grab him by the belt. This is basically the architectural equivalent of that. This is the fat guy leaning out over Broadway, and he's being restrained by the flimsiest of restraints. Someone is grabbing him by his belt so he doesn't fall into the Yankees. Right? So sheet metal is something to look for. Once you look up and realize it's there, you'll be thrilled at how much there is in this town and how it's often used to mimic other things. Back when we did this, which was 2001, we didn't have a good community of local ornamental sheet metal workers here in New York. We do now. We have at least 3 companies that can do this. So we had to bring in a company from Pittsburgh, a really good company that's still there called Nyco. And the owner of Nyco came and we were riding in a cab, and he was just amazed at how much ornamental sheet metal we have here in New York. He's like, this is a gold mine. You know? So sheet metal is something to look for. It's a fascinating material. Here's the inside of that cornice. It has a substantial brick back to it, but it probably wouldn't even need that. All it really needs are these angle-like supports and the fastening to go back to it. So it ended up being a very easy cornice to restore. Here's a piece of sheet metal from Soho. People familiar with Soho know that what we love about Soho mostly is cast iron, and we'll see some cast iron things, but I would say maybe 80% of cast iron buildings in Soho are not just cast iron, they have a sheet metal cornice to them. And because both of the materials are painted, the cast iron typically flows seamlessly from the cast iron to the sheet metal. This is from 32 Green Street, and so you can see here it's unpainted, it's just galvanized, but it's all been pressed in a mold and then assembled and soldered together to form the brackets of a slightly later, or earlier cornice. This is actually 1860s. Here's some sheet metal going on at a house on 81st Street. This actually is zinc-coated copper. So we not only have sheet metal cornices and projections, sometimes we have whole sections of facades that are made out of sheet metal. So this is actually a projecting multi-height bay window. Absolutely beautiful. The interior spaces are glorious inside this because it's a slightly bayed out window and it's all done in this patterned sheet metal. Here's a close-up of one of those brackets. This is before sanding and painting. And if you're down on Green Street, the 2 buildings that this went on to are 32 and 34 Green Street, which, like everything in Soho now, are occupied by incredibly wealthy people. But that's a kind of building that we have in New York where everything is painted. Right? So the wood storefront at the base is painted. The cast iron is painted from the 2nd story up to the top. The windows are painted, the wood windows are painted, and the sheet metal at the top is painted. And so it becomes really a showpiece for people who make really good paint and for the use of color. This is the top of that building. Conveniently shows us the date that it was built. But this is a rounded pediment. This is all new. The building next door to it, we were able to save about 80%. It's a much simpler sunburst cornice next door at 34, but this is 32 Green Street. All of these pieces are sheet metal, thin sheet metal pieces, similar to the copper, but made out of galvanized, pounded and pressed into molds, and then soldered together and attached to an armature. But it's very easy to be fooled by some of this stuff. You get a great deal of detail for not much money and not much weight. So it's kind of a win-win situation if you're building a building and you want a lot of visual interest. This is the bête noire of every preservation architect's life. This is Brownstone. This is the top of Grace Church. This is the ugly roof we replaced with that beautiful copper roof. Brownstone is in itself a whole story. There are two pieces here. One is a Canadian brownstone, and the other is a tiny fragment, if you want to pass that one around. That's East Longmeadow stone.
Where is this location?
This is the same church, Grace Church in Brooklyn Heights.
Okay.
So this is made out of probably a New Jersey brownstone, Belleville, New Jersey. That little fragment you're looking at, that's Henry Hobson Richardson's favorite stone. So if you go to Boston and you look at Trinity Church, that's the stone in Trinity Church. The beautiful suburban train stations that he did, all the glorious libraries in the library system, Northeastern Mass, places like that. That's all that stone used as trim. It was a beautiful, beautiful brownstone. Most of what we have in New York is not that beautiful brownstone, sadly. Why do we have all this brownstone? We have it for a couple of reasons. First, we have it for taste, right? We have it because the Victorian era, they liked dark, brooding buildings. So that's an aesthetic reason. But I would argue that we also have it for some very practical reasons. It comes from two places. One, Belleville, New Jersey, near Passaic. The other, Portland, Connecticut. The vast majority came from Portland, Connecticut. That's from East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. So we don't have a lot of that. There's more of that in Boston. That's what's in Trinity. It's not from Trinity, but that's the same stone as Trinity. That's a much tighter grained stone. It has a much better longevity to it. The stuff that New York is built out of, sadly, is terrible. So here you see a typical Brooklyn brownstone where we're seeing what's called exfoliation, which is the skinning off of brownstone, which happens because of the bedding planes in brown. It's a sedimentary stone, so it's laid down in shallow water, and one layer gets laid down on top of another and cemented. There's a lot of clay in the cementing material, which tends to not do well in our environment. But to get back to why it's here and why it's everywhere is it was cheap, it was easy, and it took detail very, very simply. It's what's called freestone, which means I can carve it in any direction, and it comes out looking great. But I think that one of the real reasons was, if you've ever been to Portland, Connecticut, you can still see the great big red holes in the ground where this stuff came out of. It's right next to the Connecticut River. So you take a block of brownstone out of the ground, you put it on a barge, you float it down the Connecticut River, down Long Island Sound, to either side of the island, and you build yourself a city. And so the reason we have this terrible stone, which has caused us so much trouble over the years, is convenience, aesthetics, its ease of use, and I think it's proximity and how inexpensive it was to get here.
And the only repair for it is to either replace it or
You can replace
with stucco?
You can replace it, and then there's a whole culture of what are called brownstoners that do 2 and 3 coat stucco work that simulates brownstone.
Which is often, I see the like red dye on the side.
Sometimes it's not. Yeah, it's there are people who've been doing it since the 1970s, and they're good at it.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's one of these preservation. There are also some really bad ones.
Yeah.
There are people who can't do a piece of rusticated stone, for example. So that piece of Cora stone there has got, it's got a rusticated face to it. You go sometimes on the Upper West Side or in Brooklyn, you'll see these like half-baked attempts to get that sort of texture, and it's hard to do. Another thing that can be done, and we've done this, is to use pigmented precast stone. So if you look, one of my first projects when I was a mold maker, when I got started, was Gramercy Park East, where the building that's right at the south, it's on the east side, but it's at the south end of Gramercy Park East, And a lot of that stone at the base is pigmented precast stone that I helped make in 1985. And it's still doing well. So, this is Indiana limestone, great material. Lots of wonderful institutional buildings are made out of this. This is a house on 82nd Street, 18 East 82nd Street. Here it is up close. This stone has all the workability benefits of brownstone, but none of the downsides to it. It has a couple of downsides. It's what's called a calcareous stone, which means it's basically made up of little tiny bits of bone and fossil. So it's very acid sensitive. It used to be that people did a lot of damage cleaning these buildings using acidic cleaners. We're a little bit smarter than that now. We typically just use water, and water tends to work because it swells the most common form of soiling on this, which is a gypsum crust, but I won't go into technical details about that. Here's some new versus old limestone, and you can see the characteristic way that limestone stains itself is areas that get wet but are not washed by water tend to develop a dark crust, which is actually used to be coal dust, and now it's mostly particulate matter from diesel engines, because we still stupidly bring everything we buy into New York by truck. We've never figured out how to bring it in by rail. So we still get a lot of particulate matter in the air, and what that does is it attaches itself to the wet and partially dissolving limestone. And that we can get off just with water and a lot of patience. Here's an example of some of the detail that you can get. It takes a striated detail or a rake pattern beautifully and holds it. It really is a winner of a material, and so a lot of our finer buildings here are made out of it.
So this goes, the black is going in this water?
Yeah, we now do it with what's called a prolonged water wash. What that does is it swells up the partially dissolved part of the stone, and that tiny bit can come off very cleanly with just water and maybe a little bristle brush. Look at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Just gonna say that.
That was cleaned that way primarily. There are a couple of areas where they had to go for a little bit of a harder cocktail, but primarily that was done that way. This is granite. We see a fair amount of granite in New York. This is a Deer Isle granite from Maine. If you walk around Columbia University, the wonderful pinkish granite that you're seeing is a material called Stony Creek from a quarry that goes back to the early 1800s that's still open. We take our masonry class there and visit it every year, and it's astounding. If you walk around the north edge of Battery Park, if you say you're on your way to Pier A to get some oysters, not that I've ever done that, you pass this wonderful rusticated seat wall that's very new, of these huge pieces, and that's all single pieces of Stony Creek granite, and it's just gorgeous. And if you want to make yourself even more sad about the old Penn Station, remember that it was made with Stony Creek granite. So not only was it beautiful, it was sort of rosy and pink. So they didn't just tear down a beautiful building, they tore down a rosy pink building. Just, if you really want to gang up on yourself. So this is a piece of that granite. There's a little piece here. A lot of this stuff comes from the Northeast. Our local stuff, a lot of it came from Maine, from the end of Rockport, Massachusetts, and from Stony Creek. Also, Ames, Massachusetts. And my hometown of Wesley, Rhode Island, which made most of its granite money after the Civil War because it was considered the best thing to make a Civil War statue's base out of. So the joke is there's more Westerly Rhode Island granite in Gettysburg than there is in Westerly. So this is a great stone, very tight, hard to carve, but once you get it, it'll last forever. Here's that building. I'm just going to go very quickly because I'm going to run into Brendan's time soon. This is 36 Gramercy Park East from 1912, 1913. This is another wonderful substitute material, and this is architectural terracotta. I have 3 pieces here if you want to pass them around. These are color samples from another project. This is one of my favorite materials. This is what I actually teach a course at in Columbia. Here's a material that is a ceramic material. It's pressed into molds. It's repetitive. It's actually pressed by hand. So you can see this is a back of one of the pieces, and what you're seeing here are the finger marks of someone at the Atlantic Terracotta Company around the turn of the last century, because the material was pressed into molds by hand. This was all done right around Perth Amboy, New Jersey, which is the center of our eastern terracotta industry, an industry that is gone, by the way. But this is a fully glazed terracotta facade. Here we are sound testing it first, so this is a grotesque. It sticks out about 4 feet over the sidewalk, so we ended up replacing these with new materials. There's a slightly younger me, sound testing. Here's an example of some of the existing terracotta. This is a condition called craquelure or crazing. And what this is very similar to an old dish. You have an old dish that has a little spiderwork of cracks. It is the fact that the ceramic body that the glaze is applied to is getting bigger and bigger and bigger slightly over its life through absorbing atmospheric moisture, but the glaze, which is vitreous, cannot. So it's fracturing along these cracks. It's not necessarily a problem unless it goes too far, and then it can lead to glaze spalling. Here's an example of some more of that. Here's how it's made. So here we are up in Boston Valley, which is just outside of Buffalo. It's one of the 2 functioning terracotta manufacturers we have. This is one, and the other one is in Lincoln, California, Gliding McBean. So here are pieces that have been pressed into a mold. So it's a plaster mold. The wet clay, plastic clay, has been pressed in, thumped in, and built up with webs like a cinder block. Here are the molds. It takes advantage of a wonderful naturally occurring phenomenon, which is that pottery plaster will perfectly suck out just enough water from wet clay to make the clay separate perfectly from the pottery plaster. So unlike when we cast things in concrete, we need no goop. We don't need to line everything with Vaseline. It's just a natural, and that means, consequently, we get terrific detail. If the presser has done his job well, and here's a guy throwing some what will be a red unglazed terracotta into a mold, and he's literally throwing, he starts by throwing it, because with a severe amount of force, because he wants to get that clay in intimate contact with the plaster mold. He doesn't want any air spaces, he doesn't want any bug holes or voids. He wants to get that shoved down in there and right tight against the mold so he can build up a strong piece that is faithful. Here's one of those grotesques that we saw from above. So here we are making a new one. The trick about terracotta, and what makes it a more difficult material, and I'm almost out of time, more difficult material than almost anything else we work with, is there is a dimensional issue with terracotta, which means if I want to make a new piece of terracotta, I have to know enough to start out with a slightly larger positive, because the clay, the ceramic body, is going to shrink in drying, and then it's going to shrink again in firing. And it's typically, here's some color samples, it's typically using a terracotta rule which has 13 inches to a foot. So it's a 13-inch rule that's divided into 12, and that's a good rule of thumb. So I have to start out with something that's slightly larger, and it has to go through a process, and hopefully when it's all done, it'll fit back in the building and be the right size. If it doesn't, then it gets thrown out in the back and ground up for what's called temper, or grog, which is previously fired material that gives the terracotta dimensional stability in the kiln. That's a whole separate lecture. Very quickly, here's the American Youth Hostel building, brownstone and brick. This is a remarkably good brick that's laid up in this type of bond. So when we talk about brick, we're often interested in what effects can be created by the pattern that's used. So here, this is Richard Morris Hunt from 1853, and he wants a perfectly smooth wall. He doesn't want to see any headers. Headers are bricks that are, so if this is a brick that you normally would see on a wall, header is turned with its short end to you. Right? So he doesn't want to see those. Those are what we normally use to tie the thicknesses or whites of brick together. So he's using something that sometimes is referred to as Philadelphia bond, where he's actually chopping into the brick and laying diagonal bricks to bond the thing together. So that outside face, where it says exterior, is all stretchers. There's not a single header in there. So he's getting this very high style, and there it is. Small sections, so you do get closers, but those are all going the same direction. It's a very high fired, very tight, very regular brick. So he's sparing no expense. He's also doing something really cool here, which is he's introducing a French Gothic curved slate roof, which is a neat trick if you think about how you make slate curve. The way you do it is actually to fake it, like a lot of other things we've seen tonight. You fake it by extending each slate with a curving piece of copper that you don't see above. So only a little bit of slate is actually exposed, and you can get that wonderful curve. It ain't easy. Brick, important. Here we are matching mortar. The thing to remember about any brick wall is it's an optical mixture. It's a combination of both the brick and the mortar. So you can get really terrible things visually happening to a building if you use the wrong mortar or if you use mismatching brick. Even if you have a perfect brick match, using the wrong mortar or using a mortar that's of a significantly different texture can be a problem, and sometimes it's difficult to get that texture. Here we are using a stipple brush to try and improve it. This is a wonderful building 130 East 30th Street, late cast Gilbert building with some truly terrific terracotta. Cast stone, right around the corner, is what's called the Village East now. It was built as the Jaffe Art Theater in 1926 as the home of the Yiddish Art Theater Company. And it's a wonderful fake of a building because it's all made of pigmented precast concrete. It's lovely, creamy, desert-like, sandy, because it's built as a Yiddish theater and they wanted it to have Moorish or Middle Eastern connections to it. Go look at it, it's great. We need to do a little bit of cleaning. But this is a mixture of existing and new cast stone. Here, I'm using similar technology. I'm using molds, but in this case, I'm pouring concrete into it. In this case, pigmented concrete. I don't have the same dimensional issues because the concrete is basically one size. It's going to cure. It's also not as good as terracotta because it doesn't have the fired ceramic qualities that we want. Cast iron. This is the old Bowery Lane Theater, which is now a building called 54 Bond Street. This is a rare building in New York because it's got cast iron on two sides. Most cast iron buildings, if you think about it, are really brick buildings with a cast iron front. So the brick is doing the supporting work and the cast iron is just sitting there and looking pretty. In this case, this building has to both look pretty and support some of the floor joists because it's going on two sides of the building. Here's some cast iron after restoration. Cast iron restoration is meticulous and it primarily involves getting the stripping and the painting right. So once you do it, and again, this is 32 Green Street, an example of a building where everything is painted. And there's a kind of luxury to that. So I can choose colors for the windows, for the sheet metal cornice, and for the cast iron. Usually we're required to base them on historic colors when we're in landmark districts. But it can come out really quite wonderfully because you have the real control of the color of everything. There's none of the natural material. Here it is in terrible shape at the beginning. Cast iron is a wonderful material. It's very brittle, so it can fracture. The other thing to remember about a cast iron building is it is basically screwed together. It's all screwed together with little screws, and that's what makes it so dangerous in a fire. It's not the cast iron, as people had suspected, would shatter when they turned the cold fire hoses on it. It actually is that the screws that hold everything together shear in extreme heat, and the cast iron comes plummeting to the street in great big chunks. So, but it's a remarkable material. So here you can actually see all those screw heads? This is a building that has basically been cobbled together out of pieces, and that's how we put them back together. With these countersunk screws, it's still the way we do it. Now we use stainless steel screws. Cast iron we could talk about for hours. It's a fascinating way to put a facade together because the same piece of cast iron can be both beautiful where it needs to be and functional where it needs to be. So here is basically the same piece of cast iron, or two pieces of cast iron. One of them will eventually be covered up by a plinth stone, so it's just a round piece of cast iron with no detail. The other is the base of a column. Here are some pieces of cast iron. This is to illustrate the possible beauty of wood windows. These are the Cherokee apartments. These are triple hung windows. The whole building was built for families with tuberculosis. So you could open up the apartments, and you still can to a terrific extent. Here's an example of the inside of one. They were beautifully detailed windows. The last item we're talking about is stained glass. This is the top side of the dome at the East Midwood Jewish Center. And stained glass, there it is from the underside after restoration, is one of the real joys of working. It's a totally seductive material. I have a couple of pieces here. This is an opalescent glass that's a new piece, but it's a replica of what used to be made around the turn of the 20th century. The Kokomo Opalescent Glass Company is still going. Other glass samples are from other manufacturers. We still have a really thriving culture of using stained glass in America, and we can match almost anything that we need to. And I think that's it. And I'm just cut about 3 minutes into Brendan's time. Are you there? All right. I think we probably don't have a lot of time for questions unless there's a really burning one.
What's your name again?
My name is Dan Allen.
Dan Allen?
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to
Wayne
meet
from
you.
Marvin Windows.
What's that?
Wayne from Marvin
Marvin
Windows.
Windows. Nice to meet you.
Elliot from Marvin Windows.
I think
Yeah, I was at your office not so long ago.
Yeah,
Me with
we're working-
Laura